What disturbs me the most of all the false science is the allegation that we're disturbing harbor seals.
It's been really tough.
I couldn't believe that these people who are supposed to be wearing the white hats in our society were doing what they were doing.
I have never in my career seen something like this. What they did is they tried to tilt the scales. And the way they tilted the scales is they suddenly came out and they claimed that Kevin Lunny is an environmental criminal.
We're fighting against the federal government. And when you really think about the magnitude of that, it's really kind of crazy.
Kevin Lunny and his 5 brothers and sisters were raised on their parents' cattle ranch just outside of Inverness, California. In the 1970s, many of the ranchers here were approached by developers who wanted to turn this area into large housing developments. Joe and Joan Lunny supported their neighbors in a groundbreaking agreement that allowed most of them to stay on their land.
It's home, and it's business, and it's everything. It's everything.
The ranchers, farmers, and fisheries helped create a groundbreaking agreement that led to the establishment of the Point Reyes National Seashore in 1966. The federal government was on the other end of the deal.
In the next world, I'm going to know more and what to do and what not to do.
The deal was, we'll sell you our property and you will give us 40-year leases that are renewable in perpetuity. We protect the farms and agriculture, and you protect this area from becoming a great big development.
For decades, the partnership worked very well. The ranchers were allowed to manage their own acreage, and 25,000 acres were designated as wilderness. The ranches were called working landscapes, and the wilderness acreage allowed for leisure activity, like hiking and kayaking.
Environmental protection is not mutually exclusive with well-done agriculture. And sustainability and working landscapes can all coexist.
In 2005, Kevin Lunny and his 2 brothers purchased the small but iconic Drakes Bay Oyster Farm that had been in business since 1934. They had already been in discussion with the National Park Service about what it would take to ensure that the lease would be extended.
Oyster farming has gone on in this estero for centuries.
Oyster Zone blogger Jane Georgie found that the federal government enthusiastically supported the operation for decades.
As recently as 1998, the Point Reyes National Seashore was willing to rebuild the entire facility, build an 11,000 square foot facility.
At that time, an environmental assessment concluded the proposed construction would not affect the bay's species or habitats. Before they began operations as the Drakes Bay Oyster Company, the Park Service had a long list of improvements the family had to make.
In order to get the lease in the first place, to take over the Johnson lease, they had a list of things that had to be done. So it cost in the neighborhood of $350,000 to clean it all up. So it's going to take a while to get it all paid off.
We are the last cannery in the state of California, and although it's small and it's a very temporary facility, it still produces a wonderful product.
Kevin Lunny was profiled in this 2007 publication. In the article, he's held up as an example of excellent environmental stewardship by none other than the National Park Service.
We were very excited and very honored to be a part of the Park Service magazine that recognized sustainability, recognized working landscapes and how to do it right. Then we were struck across the head with a report, items and issues that we had heard nothing about. This was the very first we heard of any concern of potential adverse effects. And at that time, we realized we have a real problem. We don't know where this is headed, but we have a big problem.
The Lunnys suspected that the report may have had something to do with the fact that their lease is due to be renewed at the end of November. The Secretary of the Interior makes the final decision on whether the farm stays or is shut down. With just weeks to go, Kevin Lunny still doesn't know how their sustainable, eco-friendly business ended up on an environmental hit list.
I don't know. I have been wondering for years what is really driving the Park Service to look for harm, to find reasons to close down something that is so important to so many Americans. 50,000 people a year come to visit this farm. It's a destination. It's an exciting cultural resource. It's an education opportunity.
The accusations in that report stunned the family. Harm to the fish, harm to the bay floor, harm to the eelgrass. A nationally known scientist who specializes in data that affects public policy was called in to fact-check the report.
I'm not pro-oyster farm, anti-oyster farm. What I am is pro-integrity, pro the right use of science. And what keeps me at this is because I would like to keep our government honest. On every single point, the Park Service had exaggerated what was going on and in fact had misdescribed. They said that the oyster feces were basically drowning the eelgrass, the fish, and were destroying the habitat. Now, they claimed that they had numbers showing that there were so many metric tons of this stuff, and it sounds horrible. I read the numbers. First thing I asked, where in the heck did those numbers come from?
As Dr. Goodman looked into these accusations and prepared for a public meeting on the matter, he had a sinking feeling that the fight was just beginning.
When a government agency gets back down on something, they have two choices. They can either admit they made a mistake, which is what we all like to hope they do, or they can start to, suddenly pull the rabbit out of the hat and start to claim new data.
While most of the nearby residents backed the Drakes Bay Oyster Company, the farm became the target of a nationwide write-in campaign by environmental groups like the Sierra Club. The accusations were used as a rallying cry to push for the elimination of the farm. Ginny Lunny manages the oyster farm.
To know how hard we've worked and to wake up every day and go back to work and know that somebody is out there writing something negative in the newspapers, it's just difficult. It's a really difficult situation. I never thought I'd see myself in a place like this.
The day came for the supervisors to review the Park Service report. Dr. Goodman had found that the basis for the claim that the oyster excrement was harming Drakes Bay had no basis in fact.
Those numbers, it winds up, that were being attributed to Drakes Estero came from a different species of oyster off the coast of Japan in completely different waters in a paper published in 1955. So they had taken a paper from 1955 from halfway around the world, and they hadn't just said, well, let's look at what happens in Japan. They had taken those numbers and claimed those were numbers from Drakes Estero today in 2000. At that time, it was 2007.
Dr. Goodman would never have found any relevant data at all if it weren't for a whistleblower within the Point Reyes National Seashore. Master's students at UC Davis had recently conducted studies on the health of Drakes Estero. The data was leaked to a newspaper, the Point Reyes Light.
Your taxpayer money, my taxpayer money, supported a study in 2005 looking at oyster feces and Drakes Estero. So I get a copy and, reading away. Oops, she says she can't detect oyster feces in the sediments. It winds up the way the water comes in and out, it's undetectable. The major organic matter in the sediments was the decomposing eelgrass. It winds up, the eelgrass in Drakes Estero is so lush, it's doubled in its acreage in the 10 years before that. And guess what? Another master's student, Jesse Weschler, had studied the fish, and the fish were thriving. They had incredible diversity, and the fish were in great shape.
The Park Service was caught hiding relevant information that exonerated the oyster farm and putting forth 1950s data from Japan as if it had come from Drakes Bay. Rather than calling it a day, they leveled yet another charge against the Lunnies. This time, it was about the harbor seals.
And in fact, they said that Kevin Lunny and his workers were doing such incredible harm to the harbor seals that this was a national emergency. They had called up the Marine Mammal Commission and notified them this was a protected marine mammal, protected by federal laws, and that they had evidence that one area, the number of seals was down by 80%.
What the superintendent told an elected official was that the harm to the harbor seals is so severe, and they are federally protected marine mammals. We're going to take both civil and criminal action, and Kevin Lunny may spend some time in jail.
You almost feel it's surreal. You're sitting and listening to people describe that the population is down by 80%.
I see how hard our family has worked. I watched my mom and dad work out here. I watched what the boys did with such enthusiasm out there.
And I said to the supervisors, we just heard these incredible claims. I ask you, please get the data. Let's look at it together, and let's ask ourselves, how could there have been no harm in 05 and 06, and now suddenly there's an 80% drop claimed to be caused by the oyster farm?
Dr. Goodman requested the harbor seal data in writing. He received no response.
And so I did something that, as an academic scientist, I'd never done before. I filed a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request. A month later, I get a response. He says, sorry, we can't give you the data and we can't answer your questions. And they evoked Exemption 5, deliberative process privilege.
While Dr. Goodman continues his quest for facts and data, the Lunnies are suffering from yet another type of stonewalling. No permission, no permits, to perform even the most basic repairs.
We are still waiting 7 years later to put roofs on all of the buildings at the oyster farm. The California Coastal Commission and the National Park Service have never approved those permits.
This is a small family farm, a very small operation that's being so bullied and being drummed out of business by the National Park Service. This is big government at its worst.
Kevin's wife, Nancy, worries about their 30 employees and where they will go if the oyster farm is shut down.
Some have been there 30 years. One family in particular, the Mata family, they have their home there too.
Not to mention the future of those in the Lunny family.
I mean, we all think about that. What are we going to do at 60 without jobs?
The Lunnies got help from the authors of the Wilderness Act, former Congressmen John Burton and Pete McCloskey. They disputed the claims that the land had been slated to be wilderness acreage.
That's why we got involved. We thought that people were trying to rewrite history, as Bill Bagley said. They're trying to rewrite the history. Well, the people that made it are still alive. I said, John, I don't remember. I supported your bill to make this wilderness. I don't remember that we were trying to wipe out the oyster farm. He said, absolutely not.
The next show of support came from none other than Senator Dianne Feinstein. She was not happy to hear that the Park Service was ignoring a Freedom of Information request for the harbor seal data.
And the senator turned to Mary Beaumar, and they were on first-name basis, and said, Mary, don't you agree? Dr. Goodman is going to get this data, isn't he? When I got that data 2 weeks later, it was clear that there actually had been an 80% decline at a location. That was a location called Sandbar A. That location was in the wilderness area. That location was far, far away from the oysters. That location, it's a long story, but the sandbar had become connected to the mainland, and both hikers, i.e., one source of problems, human beings, as well as coyotes and other predators, were getting across and chasing them away. Sure enough, there had been exactly the 80% decline in the wilderness area. Did I mention in the wilderness area? And that's where humans were disturbing the harbor seals, and there was no such decline anywhere near the oyster farm. Now, if you saw one mistake, you'd say, well, okay, you might say sloppy use of data. But the fact is now, and I've only given you the tip of the iceberg, we're seeing mistake after mistake after mistake. Misuse of data after misuse of data after misuse of data. And it's always with the same sign. It's always finding environmental harm where none exists. That's not science. That's a belief. That's an agenda. And what do I call that? In the world I come from, that's called misconduct. That's called scientific misconduct. 2 times we've asked the National Academy of Sciences at taxpayers' expense to study this, and 2 times in a row they have told us there's no evidence for environmental harm. This is not just the United States' top group of scientists. This is probably, I think, what most of the world would consider the world's finest scientific body. Neutral, right? Twice they've said there's no evidence for scientific harm. Why are we going through the charade? I mean, I would guess if you were able to dig into how much your government and my government has spent on trying to get the Lunnies and their oyster farm out of Drakes Estero, you're probably pushing $10 million, and I say that conservatively.
And Dr. Goodman has concerns about the reputation of the environmental movement as well.
Unfortunately, I've heard about cases like this in other parts of the country, and I worry about the environmental movement. And I say that to you as someone who cares very deeply about the environment, who cares very deeply about preserving biodiversity, and I worry about what's going on in different parts of the world. If they let themselves get on agendas where the ends justify the means, and where they suddenly turn and let themselves be blind to false data and false claims, they're basically starting to dig their own hole for their downfall. That's a terrible mistake for the environmental movement.
We see people like Senator Feinstein and others that recognize these were early agreements to keep the oyster farm. This is part of the diversity of our local food system. It's part of the culture of the seashore. And then we see parts of our federal government that seem to not care about our community.
We have federal monies out there right now that are helping people to start oyster farms in the Chesapeake Bay. And yet the same exact government is wanting to close an oyster farm that's been around for 85 to 90 years in Drakes Estero.
I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm not someone who's gone about my life saying conspiracy, conspiracy. But I have to say that there is an agenda here. And whatever word you want to attach to it, there's an agenda of both people working in the Park Service and a group of environmental zealots. I don't want to call them environmentalists. I'm an environmentalist. I try to look at how to protect biodiversity and how to sustain our landscape. But there's a group of people who are so intent on, quote, wilderness, that to them the ends justify the means. And I would say to you, look back through the entire history of our species, of humans, and anytime anybody gets to be such a true believer that they believe that the ends justify the means, I mean, that has been the reason for most of the horrible things that have gone on in human history. Anytime you believe that you know better than anyone else what an outcome of something should be, so that you're willing to lie and bend the truth and manipulate people, people get hurt, people get killed, or in this case, an oyster farm would get eliminated and its workers would suddenly be out jobs.
Ken Salazar will be making the decision by November 30th on whether this family-run farm stays or whether it is shut down.